Hey everybody, David R. Becker here with BeckerArt, and today I want to talk to you about gouache and watercolor, and how to use them together. I have two classes coming up this month, and both of them are where I use watercolor, transparent watercolor, and gouache watercolor together. Now there's also another gouache, and that's acrylic gouache, and I use all Holbein products, and so here are the three that I'm going to show you. And I'm using leaf green just because I had all three of these colors. But I had leaf green in transparent watercolor. That's the transparent watercolor here on the right. And then we have the gouache watercolor, which is here in the middle, and this leaf green. And then we have the leaf green in the gouache acrylic, the acrylic gouache. And I'm going to just show you the difference between how, when you use them, how they are different, and also how they are the same. So let me just move these aside here a little bit. And I just checked for myself how they work. And basically, this is the watercolor, this is the watercolor gouache, and this is the acrylic gouache. And so the acrylic gouache seems to be a lot brighter, just a little bit brighter color. And I want to tell you a little bit about the difference between the transparent and the gouache, watercolor gouache, these two, which I'm going to have the class on. So the gouache of the watercolor gouache is just opaque, and basically gouache is opaque watercolor, meaning that it is not transparent. And so you can see right here, it is very opaque and it covers up the white really well. Here with the watercolor, the transparent watercolor, which is the Holbein transparent watercolor, this now is very transparent, and you can see through the pigment because it's transparent. It's made that way so that it's a watercolor, transparent watercolor. This is opaque watercolor, which is called gouache, and then we have the acrylic gouache, which is also, these are all water media based, and so all water. And you're going to use them together, and actually sometimes use them all together. And so it's a lot of fun to be able to have that kind of amount of different mediums, but all the same in some ways, and different in so many other ways too. So let's start out with the watercolor, and let me just show you. So if I take a watercolor, transparent watercolor, which is leaf green here, and let's say I wet the surface, and I wet the surface, and then I use the green into a wet wash, then it is still very transparent, and it actually, there's not much pigment there, so there's a lot of yellow in leaf green, so you're seeing a lot of that, but you're seeing the granules of a little bit greener part too. And the thicker I make it, the more I can use an edge, so I'm making it pretty thick, but since it's transparent, it still doesn't cover up the white as like an opaque does. And let me just show you here in a second. And so there is like a transparent watercolor, and we'll just make a little round ball, and we're just going to make the top part, I guess I should make the bottom part darker. And so I'm just using thicker amount of paint, and the thicker amount of paint is used, but it's still very transparent. It doesn't cover up as much as the opaque does. Then also, if we use it on dry, let's say we just take a glob of this and do it on dry paper, even then, if I have a wet brush and I put it on there thick, it still is transparent. It's still, you can make it pretty thick and make it kind of opaque, but it's still trying to be more transparent. That's what this paint is. It's transparent watercolor. Now we do the same thing for the gouache, the watercolor gouache, not the acrylic gouache. I'm just going to clean up my brush a little bit. I'm just going to wet this surface first. Wet the surface so my brush had a little bit of transparency in it, which doesn't matter. Then I'm going to use some of the gouache watercolor. And so this gouache can be also used like a transparent watercolor, which I'm doing right now. It's still kind of transparent, but it's covering up a little bit more than, because it's finer pigment. The pigment is finer, and one of the differences from gouache way back when they used to make gouache, they used to have whitening. They used to put whitening agent in that to make it more opaque. And so they stopped doing that. Holbein does not use whitening agents to make their gouache more opaque. They just use, they grind, I think they grind their pigment finer, so it's really fine pigment, and then there's probably another kind of additive they use to it, but not whitening agent. So here you can see this is the leaf green, and I'm putting it on into a wet wash. So I'm getting a soft edge, but it's not floating as much as that because it's got so much pigment, and I'm using it pretty thick, and it's covering up. And so you're not seeing also with the transparent watercolor, you'll get granulation from the pigment that's sitting on top, and it's kind of transparent, right? Where here, the opaques will not give you granulation because it's just trying to cover up. It's opaque, and it's trying to cover up the white. And see how it is very, very solid. It's very, it covers really well. So the leaf green and opaque watercolor gouache will cover up the white much easier. Though you saw before, I'll still use it transparently, but it's going to cut. You don't have to use as much paint basically. And so let's show you again. So if I do this really lightly, if I put a lot of water here, just a little bit of this gouache, it covers really well because it's so finely ground and it covers so well. See how it's still transparent now. I can still make it look transparent like the transparent watercolor, but I don't need as much because it's trying to cover. It's trying to be opaque. And this is transparent. Now let's use it thick in a dry surface, and that's where it becomes the gouache. And watercolor can't do that because, well, it shouldn't, and you shouldn't do it that thick because this is made to be used thick, like an oil or an acrylic. You can use it that thick. And this is not even that thick, but look at how much it covers, and it sticks. It stays there. It doesn't bleed. It doesn't try to do a wet into wet soft edge. No, you're just trying to get a hard edge, and it's putting it down and covering up the paper instantly. There's no transparency to that. It's just gouache is opaque. Opaque meaning you cannot see through it. All right. So now let's go into our gouache, our acrylic gouache, which is basically like both of these together because it's mostly more like the gouache because it is gouache, but it's got acrylic filler, so it's going to dry permanent. So you won't be able to, once you get water on it after it dries, it's like plastic, right? It's acrylic, where this can be rejuvenated, or not rejuvenated, but can be taken off again. I can rub out. Here we won't be able to do that. So I'm going to take the gouache and just put it in there and see if I use it really thin. I can use it like watercolor, and that's one thing I like about using gouache is that you can also use it like a watercolor and apply it into water, and it becomes transparent. It's transparent until you start putting on more paint, until it gets thick, and it covers really well though, so you can't use a real lot. So when you're doing a tint wash, like a tint of color, then you're going to get it covering really well. And if you're covering another color that I'm going to show you in a second, I'm going to take a painting and put the paint over a painting to show you how much it is opaque. So here we go again. So this is like, let's make this part darker, and so use it thick. So it's very much like the gouache here, except it happens to be a little bit brighter. They have a little bit more of the yellow, I think, in the gouache, in acrylic gouache, than they do in the watercolor gouache. So here I'm just, and you can really feel how thick it is compared to like a transparent. You can actually feel, it's not the whitening agent that you feel, but it almost feels like it's something that's covering things up. Kind of making it muted too, but they have colors now that are very super bright, like not like the old days when they have gouache and everything looked pink or very pastel, because they use whitening agents, and when you put white with any color, it kind of makes it pastel, right? So they don't use that. They don't use whitening agents, so you get a really good slew of colors nowadays with Holbein gouache colors. So now let's also do the dry on here, and so this is like using it like oil paint, but look at how thick it is and how much it covers up the white instantly. So it's kind of fun to do it that way too. And so what I do is when I do my watercolor mixes, where I mix watercolor and gouache, I keep the gouache till the end. When I get the watercolor, the big area is done, and then I'll go back in with the small little hits of thickness, and then I can actually put texture. I can actually put texture in my wash like an oil painter does, where he puts texture or the thickness of the paint. So let's try that. I'm gonna put this aside here for a second. Turn this upside down, you can still see the colors. So I'm going to take this painting right here. This is just the painting I have all my beginner students try. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you, like if I'm using if I'm using the watercolor, let's use the watercolor. Let's put this up here a little bit higher. Just need a part of it. So if I want to use the transparent green watercolor, and I want to put a tint over that, I can, but it's going to be transparent. So let's say I want to put a little green over this. Let's say I want to put a little green over the land, and see how I'm putting a tint of it on there. And it's gonna be transparent, so you're gonna see what's underneath it. Basically, you're gonna put a light tint over it, a bit, a nice light wash, but it's transparent, so it will give it a small hit. Now let's move on to the gouache watercolor and try that over here, and just look at how much that just covers up right away. See how it just covers up right away? Again, because it's opaque, and so it's not gonna show anything through there. It's just, that's the part that I don't think many of you understand, because you're saying it's opaque, but how opaque is it? Is it really that opaque? Yes, it is. It really is. And it will really, the thicker I use it now, look at this, I can make it really thick on dry. That's in a wash, so even in a wash where it's supposed to be transparent, it's going to be a little bit more transparent if you just put it on dry thick, but when you put it into a wet wash, you can put it on so that it doesn't show anything alone. See, that's like kind of thick, like the grasses. So let's say we use the watercolor thick, which you're not supposed to really use because it could crack. Like if you make it too thick, it'll crack off. And so you don't want to make it like an oil, because it isn't made for that. Transparent watercolor is not made to be used thick, like an oil paint or an acrylic, where you want to make it thick. So let's just try it like thick like this. But watch this. Now it looks really light, but because it's transparency, when this dries, it'll become a lot darker. And that's a lot of times darker now because I have a dark underneath there. It's transparent. If it was the white of paper, it'd get lighter. Because when watercolor dries, transparent watercolor dries, it dries 20% lighter because of the amount of pigment it has there. And if you put it on really thick, you're not supposed to do the watercolor, so it's going to get 20% lighter or darker depending on what you have underneath it. So you'll see in a little second there, it's going to get lighter and lighter. Let me just show you how, if I want to take this acrylic gouache now, acrylic gouache is like the watercolor gouache, and it just covers up instantly. Look at, you use it thick like an oil paint. Now it's picking up the color underneath because it's not acrylic underneath, it's watercolor. So it'll pick up the paint underneath. So let's wet that area and just see what happens when I use the acrylic. Let's wet the area. Look how much lighter that's getting. That's going to get, really dark because, again, it's transparent. And look at how there, it didn't really cover much up, but right there, look how much that covered up. That's gouache, that's transparent watercolor. And here, let's try this in a wet wash. And see how much that is, it's wet, but look at how it just stays and covers up a really dark area that's wet. And I kind of floated on top of there, and it's fine. It'll look fine, but it will look opaque. It will be opaque, but kind of looks transparent. I love using like opaque gouache, opaque watercolor, because sometimes I use it in a wet wash, but it covers up what I want it to cover up, but still making it look very transparent, like, because you can have soft edges when you're doing wet in the wet. So I hope this helps you understand a little bit about like how you can use these two different kind of gouache and watercolor, how you can use them together, and there's different purposes for them. Let's say the leaves and the trees up here, if I want to do a light wash of just that color green, the light green, I can put a tint of the watercolor over that, right? I can make that a little bit lighter by putting a transparency over it, and it's gonna show through, because again, it's transparent. Now, if I want to do some of the leaves, and I'm going to take regular gouache watercolor, not the acrylic watercolor, or gouache, and I'm just going to tap it in really thick to paint in some leaves. And I'm just going to put in blobs of leaves, and they will stay that light. They will not, like the watercolor, it will get darker when it dries because it's transparent, and you'll see what's underneath it through it. And so this, by using the gouache, and that's why when you're using white in your watercolor, I know titanium is a white watercolor, but I would use the gouache titanium white because it's more transparent or more opaque, and so it will not bleed through. You will not be able to see through it. Though the titanium watercolor is the opaque version, Chinese white is transparent white. But see, I can just put little leaves on there, and I can make this thick. And I can actually use it like oil paints where I'm going on a dry surface and blending and rubbing together like an oil painting. You know, this is like an oil painting now. I'm doing it like an oil painting. I'm just going in here and brushing it, blending it with the thickness of the paint and not the water blending itself. And so again, the watercolor can be used, but it's not going to cover up really well. It's going to give a tint of that color. And then you can use the opaque gouache, and look at how that just, in the same thing, same water, but look at how thick that gets and how it just covers things up. Then you can do the tree here, and then I can even use the gouache, because the gouache happens to be a little bit brighter at color green, and that you just find out when you're buying the acrylics compared to the watercolor. A lot of the acrylics that they have, the gouache acrylics, are really vibrant, are very vibrant colors. They're just wonderful. And so if I wanted to use them on the tree here and just make some sides of it light, see how I can go right in there. Now this is opaque, and so there's certain watercolor competitions where you're not allowed to use opaque colors, not allowed to use gouache like TWSA, Transparent Watercolor Society of America. You cannot use opaque colors like this. You cannot use gouache, but AWS and NWS you can. So you can do this painting like this with the acrylic gouache, with the watercolor gouache, with the transparent watercolor, all of that together, and you'll still be accepted at the AWS, because they just want water media. And this is all water media, all water-based media, and fine to use all together. And so if you want to take a class of mine where I teach you, and you get to use all this product at Dillman's for free, you don't have to buy the stuff. I'm going to bring in all the supplies. I'm going to have the gouache and the watercolor, but we're not using the acrylic gouache because it's just another thing I have to get, and I think they're pretty much the same, the two gouaches, except one's an acrylic, one's a watercolor, and they act the same when you put it down, but when they dry, it's permanent. So with the watercolor-based one, you can rub it out again. You can do things like that. So that's what we're going to be using in my classes. We're going to be using watercolor gouache and not the acrylic gouache. So join me in one of those classes at Dillman's. I'm also at the Grand Marais Plein Air Fest, and I'm doing a 3-hour class there. That's just a 3-hour short, like a mini workshop they call them. It's just a 3-hour where I'm bringing the gouache, and you can use it if you're at the Grand Marais event, and you have to be part of the event, I think. Actually, you don't have to be part of the event. I think you can just be, if you're up there in Grand Marais, which is kind of far north. But if you're there, you can go on to their website, which is Grand Marais Plein Air Fest, I think it's something like that. But check it out. And again, just to go over really quickly one more time: transparent watercolor, opaque gouache watercolor, and opaque acrylic gouache. And you saw how I used them. Transparent, opaque. All right. And so this week we're doing, for the paint along on Thursday nights, I'm going to be doing a kind of an abstract kind of looking of Paris and the Eiffel Tower, and we're putting some circle of confusions all over everything. And so we're going to try to use a little bit of gouache and watercolor at the same time. We can use that too, and some rubbing out and some stencils. So check it out on Thursdays and go to my website to find out what we're painting, or sign up for my newsletter, which comes out tomorrow, and this will be in my newsletter also. All right, and so till then, we'll see you on Thursday. Bye-bye.